quantitative easing, quantitative tightening. What the heck is this stuff? How is it going to affect us? What is the Fed up to? The fascinating piece over in the Financial Times here is titled "The Fed Gets Scary" by Robert Armstrong and Ethan Wu. Let's talk about this with a genuine expert. Professor Richard Wolff is an economist, professor of economics, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His latest, "The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself." Prof Wolff with 2 Fs on Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back. So quantitative easing, quantitative tightening. This has to do with the Fed buying and selling bonds, if I understand this correctly. Can you explain what this stuff is and why we should care?
Yes. First of all, the Fed is the name we give in this strange country of ours to our central bank. In other countries, it's called the central bank. Because of our weird history, we call it the Federal Reserve System. But it is the central bank, and it has the same responsibilities that central banks have in most other countries, namely to control the money supply in the economy and to control the interest rate at which money is lent from lender to borrower. These are extremely important things. You know, the old saying, money makes the world go round. Well, if money is as important as that is, and most of us know that it is, well, then it shows you how powerful the government always is in a capitalist society, because the government is given the role of controlling the money, mostly because when it used to be controlled by individual banks, the level of chaos and corruption was so enormous that it was taken away from the private sector and given to the government, which didn't mean that problems didn't exist, but that's the logic of what it has. All right, so quantitative easing means simply that the Federal Reserve, our central bank, thinks the economy is in trouble, and so it's going to pump money in. It's going to literally create money, lower the interest rate so it can people can borrow it and industries can borrow it, and they go into the economy where the government bonds exist. From previous years, when the government borrowed money, it gave the people it borrowed from a bond, literally a piece of paper, a kind of IOU, and the Federal Reserve comes in, prints brand new money, and buys the bonds from industry, from banks, from rich people. The rest of us don't participate in that market. And in that way, it pumps the money up into the economy. That's quantitative easing. Quantitative tightening is the reverse. That's when the Federal Reserve sells the bonds it bought last year or the year before back into the public, thereby pulling money out of the economy into its own hands and locks it in a vault or burns it. It really doesn't matter. But it is the way the Federal Reserve moves money in and pulls money out of the economy with the goal of keeping us from a depression or a recession on the one hand, and keeping us from an inflation on the other. So my final point is, since we have had 3 crashes already in this new century, and we're now living through a terrible inflation, it's clear that the Federal Reserve either cannot or will not use these tools, or they don't work, which is why that article you read in the Financial Times is very worried.
So, I mean, you know, the Fed has been around since 1913, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yes. Yes.
You would think, and clearly, I mean, you know, John Maynard Keynes, as I recall, wrote his. Maybe I'm off on this, but somebody wrote their. No, it was Janet Yellen who wrote her dissertation on. Well, one of the Fed chairmen in my lifetime, anyway, might have been Bernanke, wrote his dissertation on the Great Crash in 1929 and how the Fed failed to use monetary policy to deal with the Great Depression, how they arguably made it worse by keeping the money supply tight. How is it that it's been over 100 years and they haven't figured out how to make this work? Or is it just a really blunt instrument?
Well, you know, it's mostly the reality of our economic system. I know it's not fashionable to talk about it, and certainly folks like Yellen and Bernanke avoid what I'm about to say like the plague. But the reality of it is that our capitalist economic system has produced inflations and economic downturns on a pretty regular basis. Now, the amount of years between one and the next one varies, but we're very sure that on average, our own government has said this, every 4 to 7 years we have a crash, and every decade or so we have an inflation. The Federal Reserve simply doesn't have the capability, it doesn't have the tools with which to deal with this intrinsic systemic problem of our capitalist system. And people don't want to face it, so there's an endless self-delusion that, oh, well, we didn't get it right last time, we'll get it right the next time. Well, it doesn't work. Okay, well, we'll adjust it a little bit and we'll get it right the next time. After a certain number of these, a rational person ought to conclude, as some of us have, that the problem isn't that the tools aren't quite right, it's that we have a system that is not vulnerable, is not susceptible to being manipulated in the way these folks want, and therefore we're continuously plagued by these kinds of instability.
Now, there are some economists that I've been reading recently who are suggesting that basically we're trying to, hammer a nail with a screwdriver. That we're using the wrong tool for the problem. That the crash of 2000, the crash of 2000 and the crash of 2008 were the direct result of deregulation of the banking industry and of the mortgage industry that invited criminal activity, and criminals basically crashed the system both times. Criminal bankers, those criminal bankers made off with a pile of money. The same thing in the 80s when Reagan deregulated the S&L industry, and that crashed, and we had that big crash, and then you had to have the Resolution Trust Corporation to put that back together, which was not the Fed. Arguably, that was using the right tool to solve the problem, but that the Fed and that right now the inflation that we're experiencing is the entirely predictable consequence of having come out of 2 years of suppressed demand with an explosion of demand, combined with the fact that there are still supply chain problems that have to do with the way that China is dealing with COVID. And by the way, it's going to get worse. And that if you look at inflation, even the inflation of the 80s that was caused by the spike in oil prices, another demand-driven, a demand-supply imbalance-driven inflation, that inflation was not solved by the Fed. It just took a decade to flush it out of the system. And this inflation won't be solved by the Fed. It'll just take a decade to flush it out of the system. But the Fed is dancing because everybody expects them to do a dance. Does any of that make sense?
Absolutely. But let me push back just a little bit. I'm perfectly happy blaming the Fed. It makes one mistake after another. It doesn't seem to learn from its own mistakes. It dances, as you rightly say, to the pressure of the politics to do something about an inflation, which is a very dangerous thing to put an economy through after 2 years of crash and COVID. But your very example shows what I'm talking about. When you point to the criminal behavior of the banks, and you're quite right, one logic would have been to say, when and if banks privately owned and operated for a profit mess up the financial and monetary system of a country, one of the things to discuss, which comes, of course, but is public banking. In other words, take it out of the private sector, which is as prone to profit-driven criminal or quasi-legal activities today as it was 20, 50, and 100 years ago. Part of why we have the Federal Reserve is the criminal activity of banks.
Yep.
You'd think in a rational system, we talk about public banking as a way to deal with that part of the problem. But since we don't, then we ask of the Fed what it clearly can't do, and then we sit here having these kinds of conversations.
Yeah, and Bernie, opened this conversation pretty aggressively. I mean, he's been talking about this actually on this program for almost 20 years, about a very small start to public banking by doing it through the post office.
Absolutely.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yes. And look, there are, at least that I'm aware of myself, a dozen states and cities in this country right now in advanced stages of discussion about public bankings, either chartered by a city or chartered by one of our states. People know about this. There's plenty of examples all over Western Europe in our allies who have public banks of all different kinds, either operated by their post office, as in the French example, for example, or major players in the savings bank business, which is what Germany has. Right. So we have lots of ways to explore and look at public banking if we don't want to be vulnerable to this bizarre dance, and I like your word, between the private banks hustling to make a buck and the Federal Reserve, which is in bed with them anyway, supposedly regulating them, and they don't do a real good job in this dance.
And cleaning up their damage.
We don't question why we allow this particular dance to continue to be played at our expense.
Yeah, my recollection, we have just a minute left here. My recollection is that North Dakota, am I remembering that right, or is it South Dakota? One of them.
It's North
Dakota has had a public bank since 1909, if I'm remembering correctly?
That's right. North Dakota, hardly a bastion of socialism or Bernie support or anything like that. North Dakota, a conservative state, has had a public bank, I believe, since 1916, so over a century now. Republicans and Democrats have tried on occasion to get rid of it. They failed. The big American banks from the East tried to stop it. It failed. The conservative farmers and businesses and people of North Dakota have insisted on keeping the big bank in their state a public institution that lends to local people and businesses and that folds its profits back into the budget of the state so that the state doesn't have to tax the mass of people as much as it otherwise would.